This is the Dig Podcast's 16-part series on the 20th century political history of the Mashriq, or Arab East. 16 parts plus a 2-part epilogue. I spent nearly 40 hours with the brilliant historian Abdel Razzaq Takriti to tell this giant, comprehensive story, focusing above all else on the diverse radical currents that emerged to challenge Western imperialism and colonialism across the region, very much including the ongoing Zionist settler colonial project in Palestine. Abdel Razzaq Takriti, or Abid for short, he started out as my guest. He very quickly became Thawra's co-creator. When we started the series in February, Abid and I only had a vague sense of where we were going. Now that we're done, we sat down to record this short preface in order to give you a sense of what to expect. This series is not just about Palestine, but also an in-depth political history of Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf states. It's also a history of the Western imperialism and colonialism that have, for more than a century, fundamentally shaped the region. Thawra is a political education project dedicated to undoing the reactionary, colonialist propaganda fueling support for the unfolding Israeli genocide in Gaza, and all the horrors that led up to it. The West has convinced itself, perversely, that we are the victims of an Arab world full of backward fundamentalists who irrationally want to do violence unto us. This wildly absurd view is only credible if the real history of the region and the West's role within it is thoroughly mystified. Thawra is a project aimed at the very heart of the mystifications that have sustained a century plus of colonialism and imperialism in the Middle East. Mystifications that led to the current genocide in Gaza. It's a history that we grasp not only by studying the cloak and dagger politics of elite actors, but also from a long look at those revolutionary movements in the Middle East that endeavored to make an altogether different world. This is a comprehensive history unlike anything you'll find elsewhere. Here's a quick conversation with Abid to explain a bit more. Abid, for starters, I think we should emphasize a basic historical and conceptual point, which is that you can't understand the history or present of the Arab East without putting colonialism and imperialism front and center. It's not just one or an occasional facet of regional politics. It was and remains absolutely, overwhelmingly, inescapably central. And so as a result, so much of the Arab politics we explore, there are these various currents grappling over how the Arab East can confront and move beyond these persistent, painful realities of constant Western intervention.
Right. And this is what's so glaringly obvious in this part of the world, but that is sometimes hidden in the standard Western narratives around it. When people talk about colonialism and imperialism, it's often presented in the West as a way of allocating blame elsewhere for regional failures. Somehow they turn it around and it becomes about these Arabs are so self-absorbed in their own lives. They don't want to accept responsibility for their own failures, which is, of course, a classic colonial trope in its own right. And of course, we see it used against racialized and oppressed populations worldwide, including within the United States itself. When people start saying, oh, why are Native Americans, or why are racialized populations, Black populations, Latinx populations, others, why are they blaming the ruling order for the ills they are facing? There's this attempt to dismiss their very profound experiences, and these are structural experiences. So here, the role of progressive and critical thought is to come back and say, actually, these structural facts, they matter because they shape the world we live in. The world we live in is not a world in which you had somehow this equal set of opportunities out there. This myth of like you just have to have self-reliance and accept responsibility for your actions and you'll be fine. That's not the way the world functions. And colonialism and imperialism definitely have undermined the trajectories of this particular part of the world, partly because the sovereignty question in that part of the world is still not resolved and has not been tackled for a long time. The external intervention in this region has created multiple small states that have had a set of legitimation crises that are very profound. It has entrenched a system of rule that is very much absolutist in nature in most of the monarchies and dictatorial in nature in most of the republics. This was not just a byproduct of internal trajectories. It was, as we show in this series, external powers played a big role in it. Telling that story while accounting for local agency and for the role of people in creating their own histories, and also for local contingencies that took place and produced undesired results as a result of different processes that people could not have possibly foreseen at the time, is a challenging task. But we try to do both. In Thawra, we do not belittle the role of colonialism and imperialism because it's a very profound role and it continues to this day. And honestly, Daniel, if you look at the region today, it is practically one gigantic American base with a major settler colony planted in the heart of it. This is quite astonishing. So we cannot ignore that. There are, of course, sites of resistance to that project, but the map does not lie this way. And if you look at the amount of American military investment and wars that were subjected to that region, certainly in the past 20 years, this region has been the main focus of America's military entanglements in the same way that Latin America in previous decades used to be the main focus. So we have this set of realities that cannot be ignored, but that are often brushed aside in the mainstream, either through a complete dismissal or through utter silence. Who's talking about the Iraq War today, for example? Who's talking about the Gaza genocide today? These are important questions. Now, while we talk about the colonial and imperial role, we also allocate much time, Daniel, on the different attempts of local forces and political parties and large-scale mass-based movements to try to create a different world. And we talk about the limitations of these attempts. And we talk about often the distractions that happened, that took place, that prevented a greater coordination between these movements. Because the other dimension that's important in Thawra is actually that we are reflecting here on the limits and possibilities of progressive leftist action that took place with an eye to learning lessons for the future.
This present reality of the region being one giant U.S. military base with a settler colony in the middle of it, it's in so many ways the product of the defeats suffered by these revolutionary movements, these extraordinarily varied revolutionary movements that we focus on in Thawra. Why amid today's genocide in Gaza, which is the context within which we decided to do this series together, why do you think that it's important to recover and learn from this history of all of these political currents that challenged Western imperialism, colonialism, and Zionism, most notably, but not exclusively, Arab nationalism, communism, Baathism, and also the many currents that waged the Palestinian Revolution, from Fatah to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine? Why is this history a useful one for us now? We are not just doing this series for the sake of revolutionary trivia.
That's absolutely true. And Daniel, if we want to understand the context of the current genocide, everything we've been doing in this series relates to this context. For example, listeners might want answers to the question of why is it that you have a big state like Egypt that's bordering Gaza, sitting around, having its own sovereignty violated by this Israeli settler colony, being subjected to aggressive action and witnessing a huge genocide, a total daily massacre unfolding every minute, every hour next door. And they're not only doing nothing, but they're also complicit. Where does that come from? Would it have happened 40, 50, 60 years ago? These are important questions. Why is it that you have a situation where there's an active front, for example, alongside the Lebanese border today, but not in the case of the Jordanian border or the Syrian border? Why do we have a situation where Saudi Arabia is silent? These are questions that have to do with each individual state. But to understand the actions of each one of these states, we have to understand their trajectories, their actual experiences, and the way their political histories developed. We also have to understand their political interests and economic interests and the way their social movements have fared. To understand this genocide also, we have to examine the centrality of the Palestinian cause to the region, because there is also massive and unprecedented popular mobilizations connected to this genocide, but also they have a long history to them, a history of solidarity with Palestine that is unparalleled with solidarity with any struggle in that particular region. And throughout this series, we see that Palestine to the Arab East is the equivalent of South Africa to the Southern African region, or Vietnam to the East Asian region, or to Cuba in Latin America. It was a catalyst for solidarity, for revolutionary imagination, and it continues to be so, to be that. It serves that function to this very day. So these are important issues to think about. We through engaging with this history, we try to look at how the different states in the region are operating, but also how the different Arab movements in the region are operating. Now, more importantly, also, we're looking at how Palestinian politics developed and how it developed in relation to this very violent Zionist settler colonial project. And that Zionist settler colonial project is often misunderstood because it is not usually treated in relation to the regional realities that prevailed in the broader Arab East. I don't think you will see that kind of treatment happening in most settings. The way this issue is talked about in the American mainstream is often in terms of the particular history of the Jewish people in isolation of the history of the Palestinian people and the surrounding Arab region. It's a very particular type of Jewish history also that marginalizes the voices of Arab Jews, as well as the voices of anti-Zionist Jews that try to challenge this project. In Thawra, we talk about those experiences, but we also talk about the meaning of having a settler colony put in the middle of a region like the Arab East and the catastrophic implications this had on everybody. So the genocide, once it's viewed in this historical perspective, we start understanding that it's part of a colonial continuum, a long-standing colonial continuum. It could not have happened without authorization from the Western states today, but also it could not have happened without all the enormous amount of work they did to impose on this region a new settler colonial reality. Now, when it comes to revolutionary movements and their relation to the relationship to the current genocide, the discussion is multifaceted. And I think that in Thawra, we invite reflection rather than just clear-cut answers to these questions. But one area for reflection is, what does it mean for something like the Palestinian anti-colonial struggle to have been led at one point by secular forces that were influenced often by leftist ideologies, that were definitely exhibited different forms of engagement with Marxism, with third worldist leftist thought, with different political traditions? What did it mean for it now to come into a new era where the resistance of an armed kind definitely is now led by Islamic movements. And how is that used? Both, what does it mean locally for social and economic struggles and other struggles that have to do with internal Palestinian and Arab arena, but also what does it mean for the attempts of colonial forces at delegitimizing the Palestinian people and attacking them and undermining them? And how does it intersect with war and terror ideologies that have wreaked havoc against the Arab people and on the Arab world and broader Muslim world for quite a while now? So all of these questions are important. Also, I think it's through providing historical context, we're able to understand better both the leftist movements that operate on the ground, but also the Islamic currents, including Hamas, including Islamic Jihad, including other parties that people don't often talk about, like Hizb ut-Tahrir and others. Where do they come from? What are they responding to? What's the colonial context out of which they emerge? These are questions that we answer. And I think once we have greater depth, we can understand the political realities on the ground better, but also for those that are interested in leftist revival or progressive revival, we can begin to reflect on better pathways for engagement, given the fact that we've reflected on the lessons of the past.
How would you situate the history that we do here in terms of the existing scholarship of Middle Eastern and Arab politics? And then relatedly, how does what we're doing here relate or contrast with the Orientalist conventional wisdom about Arab politics, the popular common sense that is so dominant among so many people in the West? You already touched on this a bit in terms of the conventional framing of the Israeli story.
The series builds upon decades of scholarship that has been trying to reject the Orientalist narrative and contest it and build a better, basically, model of knowledge. And I use better with emphasis here because I do believe that emancipation is better than domination. And Orientalism at the end of the day was geared towards dominating this part of the world or facilitating that domination or justifying it. Whereas, and to this day, we have variants of that happening. Now it's less likely to be seen in traditional university departments, and you see it more and more in places like think tanks and policy centers and that sort of
The Atlantic magazine,
places like that, for sure. But you still find residues, of course, in universities. You still find residues even in progressive spaces. Even lack of interest in understanding this history in detail is a form of Orientalist approach in itself, because what it does is it's a way of saying, well, I can talk about this part of the world without really knowing anything about it or engaging with it or having the desire to learn anything about it. So fortunately, I think the new generations and certainly the new forms of progressivism that we're seeing developing nowadays are not adopting the stance. And we see massive interest actually in studying different parts of the world and understanding them and engaging with them on their own terms. So this is a very positive development. However, while there's been a lot of work at challenging Orientalism at the discursive level, in my own scholarship, I've noticed, and this is in a way what I was trying to do as a scholarly project, but also in Thawra, for a variety of reasons, the traditional political history arena has been left to reactionary forces and to right-wing forces. We've done good work on some aspects of social history. You know, there have been good studies that have appeared in that regard, although not enough since the 1980s. After the linguistic turn and the discursive turn, we had the decline in that kind of work, and I think we need more of it to come back. Studies of workers' movements, studies of peasant movements, studies of movement in general that are grounded in very rich investigations of the trajectories of how people organize and mobilize and challenge different aspects of oppression in their lives. This is a very important need, and I think in Thawra we try to account for these different social struggles. But also, this is not to dismiss, you know, some of the studies that have taken place in the past. It's just saying that we need more of that. And I hope that Thawra will offer an invitation that would encourage people to do more of that kind of work, but also political movements, which, again, that field has often been seen as, well, we'll leave that for the right-wing people. They're the ones that study this. And in a way, there's a certain stigma around it. It's about kings and battles. It's about, leftist histories in general developed to this taste towards that field. But what's very important to note is, in the case of colonized spaces, that field needs to be emphasized, actually, because we have to talk about the story of the movements that were trying to emancipate and that were worked really hard, in which thousands of women and men and millions of people around them, around these committed cadres, were trying to change the world around them. That's not a story relating to the established order, celebrating the established order. It's a radical story. It's a story worth telling for any progressive person. But it cannot be told without understanding also the reactionary world around these people. And that's where the histories of state formation and the histories of imperial powers and their intersection of what's going on the ground, any serious study has to account for all three different angles. And in a way, that's what we've been trying to do in Thawra. Our horizon is emancipatory. That's our focus. That's obviously our objective. I know that's why you do what you do, Daniel, and that's why I do what I do. That's why we care about public political education. But at the end of the day, while caring and loving the popular movements, we care about them and love them the most, obviously. But also we want to understand the environment in which they were entangled and the foes against which they were battling.
We're at a moment when the American left, at least, it feels like it's becoming increasingly divided and sectarian as people in the movement, I think, despair at our inability, even amid a year of such widespread mass mobilization, our inability to force the U.S. and Israel to put an end to the genocide in Gaza. The Arab radical and revolutionary movements that we discuss in this series, they were also often, very often, in conflict with one another, sometimes lethal conflict. What can we learn today as organizers and political actors from how Arab radicals succeeded or failed at confronting all sorts of intense dilemmas throughout the 20th century?
Well, Daniel, there is no simple answer to this, but in a way, we can provide a simple answer, which is the simple, quick answer is sectarianism is a bad idea when you're confronting a major foe like colonialism and accompanied by a hydra of capitalism, social oppression, patriarchal oppression, and the full package. You're dealing with a horrendous combination, a toxic combination, a monstrous combination that is really creating a lot of oppression on the ground, both economic, social, and political. So if you're going to go sectarian and fighting it, you might not achieve the desired results. And that we have seen in very specific but very important moments in modern Arab history that have had disastrous results. So there's at least three major currents to the Arab left that we've focused on in this series and that constitute the core movements, largest movements that have operated in the region. There's the communist current, which is the oldest, and in many ways, it has a very rich theoretical history and a rich also history of engagement. And then you have the Ba'athist and the movement of Arab nationalist currents. These are the big three movements that have shaped the Arab left in many ways. You can count them as mother movements. They produced multiple different, of course, offshoots and splits. But the contests between these three have really weakened them in certain key moments. We've seen this in Iraq. The purges that had happened initially against the Ba'athists and the nationalists, but then later on against the communists, were not helpful. The contests, even in a different direction on the state level, the contest between Abdel Karim Qasim and Jamal Abdel Nasser was not helpful. the bloody histories of confrontation between these different movements really affected the future of the region in powerful ways. I'm not saying, and certainly in Thawra, we, while emphasizing this fact, we do not dismiss the historical contingencies that produced it. In fact, we're very attuned to the nuances of why this happened. There's mutual suspicion. There are moments when people felt that they could either die or fight the other movements. There were also profound ideological disagreements. And in today's movements, we do have profound also ideological disagreements. Back in the 1950s, the communists were right to suggest that they have a much more anti-capitalist program to the Ba'ath, for example. The Ba'ath, for example, it was not advocating the full transfer of the means of production from ownership over the means of production from the capitalist classes. Okay, so over the question of capitalism, there were serious disagreements. But it was, however, promoting different forms of social democracy, greater intervention of the state in the market, and so on and so forth, which would have been definitely, from a leftist perspective, an advantageous relative to what had preceded it. But the communists would have said that they have a more actively radical vision in that regard. Likewise, from a Ba'athist perspective, they would have said that the fact that they were unfettered by directives from Moscow meant that they could develop a fully anti-colonial vision when it came to places like Palestine and elsewhere, and even Syria and Lebanon. And we saw that actually the Ba'ath itself emerged out of a struggle over what should be done in relation to Syrian and Lebanese independence in the mid-30s. So these ideological disagreements are profound. But at the end of the day, there has to be a working formula. There has to be a way to find a sense of focus around the big and very powerful, coalition that is promoting oppression in the world that we're living in. And here in the United States, this is a very powerful set of forces. Finding common ground is really, really important. It does not mean sacrificing ideological visions. It does not mean actually saying, let's have a kumbaya moment and we're all happy and everybody is in agreement and it's all great. There needs to be a very clear understanding of what brings people together, while also people can also reflect on what drives them apart. But what troubles me often is not even the ideological disagreements, Daniel. What troubles me about the American left sometimes is that often much of the conversation is, certainly in relation to Palestine nowadays, is somehow restricted to the realm of tactics, not even strategies, not even principles, tactics. And people allow entire relationships to collapse over tactical discussions. And I'm like, that is unacceptable in the context of a genocide like this. We need a major historic bloc to be formed to be able to overthrow the system. Okay, and that historic bloc will need to integrate a broad social base. It will need to think about the Gaza genocide in relation to also different modes of oppression that are operating internally within this country, but also externally. It has to invite us to ask bigger questions about how American politics works as a whole. Again, the genocide in this way actually tells us a lot about the world we live in. It's a world in which you can have an entire Congress, with a few exceptions, going comfortably to sleep at night while they're actually not only authorizing, but funding and arming the killing of an entire people. It's quite amazing. So what does that tell us about this whole system? What does it tell us about the coalition that needs to be activated to defeat this system? These are big questions. We have to ask them boldly. We have to ask them honestly, without ego, without being overly obsessed about baggage, organizing baggage from the past. We have to ask them with a sense of commitment to the people on the ground that are suffering. Once our compass is pointing towards Gaza, once we have this clarity, then we would not allow pettiness to stand in the way of political engagement that could be beneficial and helpful and hopefully emancipatory in its outcome.
Thank you very much for listening. Again, The Dig is a political education project dedicated to helping us all better understand this world in order to change it. I'm so grateful to Abid for making Thawra with me. If you like what you listen to here, please support us at patreon.com/thedig. And if you want to listen to other Dig episodes beyond our Thawra series, and we really do cover everything, subscribe to The Dig wherever you get podcasts.